Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're diving into a really interesting part of Japanese history. And honestly, it's kind of wild how one single title, like back in the day, ended up shaping Okinawa's fate. We're talking about Lord of the Southern Islands. And, you've given me these excerpts from George Kerr's book, Okinawa, The History of an Island People. It's like, whoa, talk about power, ambition, and how things from way back when can still have consequences centuries later, right?
It's amazing, isn't it? Like a slow burn that explodes into massive historical change. And the Shimazu clan, they were really something else.
Yeah, Kerr talks about their estates in Kyushu being enormous, practically a mini empire.
Yeah,
It's giving Game of Thrones vibes for sure.
totally. And they weren't just big landowners, they were practically independent. Kerr mentions that their lands were basically tax exempt, showing just how autonomous they were, even from the central Japanese government.
Wow, so they were already flexing their independence early on. But how did they go from powerful landowners to claiming the Ryukyu Islands, Okinawa included?
Yeah.
That's a huge jump.
You're right, it's a big jump. And it all comes down to that title, Lord of the Southern Islands. One of the early Shimazu leaders, Tadahisa, he was given this title maybe as early as 1187.
Okay, so they get this title, but did that automatically make them rulers of Okinawa back then?
Well, that's where things get a bit, I guess you could say, murky. The sources, they kind of hint that this title might have originally just referred to some smaller islands close to Kyushu, not the whole Ryukyu archipelago as we know it now.
So it was kind of like a vague claim to begin with.
Exactly. But, and this is important, the Shimazu, they kept passing this title down through generations of leaders.
So every new leader, they didn't just inherit the title, they inherited the claim that went with it, even if it was, like you said, a bit murky.
Exactly. It's like they were holding on to this idea, this potential claim, while things were developing over in Okinawa.
Speaking of Okinawa, what was happening there during all of this? While the Shimazu were in Kyushu, holding on to this title, Okinawa wasn't just sitting still, right?
Oh, absolutely not. Around the 13th century, Okinawa started shifting towards a more centralized system of power. Uriso, you know that area. It emerged as a central hub.
Okay, so while the Shimazu were doing their thing, Okinawa was becoming more organized, more centralized. Was this purely an internal development in Okinawa? Or were there outside factors, maybe from Japan itself, influencing this?
Great question. And Kerr, he kind of hints at this. He talks about mounting pressure from Japan happening at the same time as these changes in Okinawa. It's very possible that increased trade and contact with Japan, well, it probably played a big role in pushing Okinawa in this direction towards more centralized power.
So you've got Okinawa, they're developing, they're more connected, and meanwhile, over in Kyushu, generations of these Shimazu leaders, they're holding onto this claim, Lord of the Southern Islands. Sounds like all the ingredients for,
Yeah, you can feel the tension building, right? It's all coming to a head.
So we left off with Okinawa, right in the middle of all this change, internal and external pressures, and then you have the Shimazu clan just kind of waiting in the wings with their Lord of the Southern Islands claim. You could just feel something's got to give.
Oh, yeah, it's like a historical pressure cooker, and guess what? It finally blows. 1609, the Shimazu, they invade the Ryukyu kingdom.
Centuries after getting that title. It just shows you how these claims, even if they sound kind of shaky at first, can be used to grab power. So they actually used the Lord of the Southern Islands thing to justify invading.
Oh, absolutely. The Shimazu, they basically said, hey, this title we've got, it means we're in charge of Okinawa too. It really shows you how much weight these historical claims had back then.
It's like we got to look back to understand how things played out, you
Yeah.
know? So the Shimazu conquers Okinawa, but is this the end of Okinawa's independence then?
For the most part, yeah. But it's not like the Ryukyu kingdom vanished overnight. They got forced into this tributary relationship with the Shimazu, which, by the way, lasted for centuries.
A tributary relationship. What does that even mean? Like, how did that affect Okinawa's freedom?
So basically, the Ryukyu kings, they're still around, but they're like under the Shimazu's thumb. They had to pay tribute, couldn't just do their own thing anymore. Imagine having to keep the Shimazu happy while trying to hold on to your own culture, your identity. Not easy.
Wow, that's got to be tough, playing that kind of balancing act for so long. What about the long game here? Like, how did this conquest affect Okinawa later on, especially with Japan stepping in during the 1870s?
Huge implications. Think of it like this. The Shimazu conquering Okinawa in 1609, it set the stage for Japan to come in and say, well, they did it, so we can do it too. Kerr even connects these events directly, showing how something that happened way back when can still have consequences hundreds of years later.
Like a domino effect, one thing leads to another. We've been focusing on the Shimazu and how ambitious they were, but what about Okinawa? What were their thoughts on all of this? Did Kerr talk about that at all?
He focuses more on the Shimazu, but he does give us glimpses into what was happening within Okinawa. Like, he mentions this leader, Iso, who made all these changes, strengthening central control, boosting trade with Japan.
So even before the invasion, Okinawa was already changing, becoming more connected with Japan. That must influenced how they reacted to the Shimazu, right?
Definitely. It wasn't like Okinawa was just sitting back and letting things happen to them. They were trading, talking to other nations, building their culture. All of that played a part in how they dealt with the Shimazu invasion.
It makes you wonder, what if things had gone differently? Like, what if Okinawa wasn't in the middle of all those internal changes? Would they have been able to fight back against the Shimazu?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Historians, we love to think about that kind of stuff, the what-ifs of history. It shows how unpredictable history is. It's not just a straight line. It's more like, well, a tangled-up mess sometimes.
So we've talked about the Shimazu, their ambitions, Okinawa's internal developments, and that whole what-if scenario. But didn't you mention something about Okinawa going through some internal shakeups right before the invasion?
Yeah, Kerr mentions this guy, Tamagusuku. He took over after Iso died, but it sounds like he wasn't quite up to the task. Kerr calls him dissolute, even unfit to rule. Seems like he had trouble keeping things together. You know, all that centralized power Iso had built up.
Oh, wow. So while the Shimazu are getting ready to pounce, Okinawa is dealing with some instability at the top. Do you think the Shimazu knew about this, like, saw an opportunity?
It makes you wonder, right? Maybe they thought, hey, now's our chance. It really highlights how important a strong leader is, especially when you've got external threats looming.
Totally. It's crazy how one change in leadership can have such a huge impact. Talk about a power vacuum.
Exactly. Kerr doesn't go into a ton of detail about Tamagusuku or what was going on internally in Okinawa then, but it's definitely a factor. It shows how these things are all connected, you know, internal struggles, external pressures. It all adds up.
Man, this deep dive has been a wild ride through history. We've covered centuries, from the Shimazu's rise to the conquest of Okinawa. So, as we wrap up, what's the biggest takeaway for you?
I think it's the interconnectedness of it all. The Shimazu conquering Okinawa, it wasn't just some random event. It was the result of ambition, strategy, internal struggles, all these pressures coming together.
It really makes you think twice about those minor details in history. A title, a leader, they can have a much bigger impact than you'd think.
Absolutely. And that's what makes history so fascinating. There's always more to discover, more connections to uncover.
And for you listening, we hope this deep dive inspires you to keep asking questions, keep exploring. Who knows what other hidden connections are waiting to be found?